My guest this week is a Canadian television host, a video game journalist, and a cosplayer, most importantly. Liana Kerzner, welcome to the Rubin Report.
Thanks for having me.
I thought maybe you'd be dressed up in some sort of cosplay type thing. Maybe just a little witch or wizard or...
Well, I actually am. I'm wearing sort of a steampunk belt off camera. It is sort of a pirate shirt. It does sort of...
Oh, there you go.
I tried to tone it down. Yeah.
That's very puffy shirt, Seinfeld, sort of.
Yeah, it's the French cuffs. It's there's never a time I don't really separate cosplay from the rest of the world. I do not do the girly stuff well, and so I learned to sort of put outfits together by following superheroes. So if a superhero can wear a combination of colors, it's okay. Otherwise, I know to avoid it. So there's really no separation for me.
That's pretty much how the Big Bang Theory people dress, isn't it?
I've heard that, and I have not seen that episode. I don't watch that show because I kind of live that show. But yeah, I've heard this a few times that they say the same thing. And it really is true. It's also how I teach color theory to media production interns. It's like, Superman colors mean good. Hero, Joker colors mean sort of, counterculture. So when you're lighting a set or you're dressing a character, that matters.
Yeah, all right. Well, I do want to get into some of that stuff. But real quick, let's just do cosplay real quick because I think a certain amount of people have no idea what it is. So first I want you to define what it is, but I think you already said something interesting, which is that it's integrated into your life all the time. Usually cosplayers, I think, they're going around dressing normally. I'm going to get hate for that word, whatever you want to call it, dressing like ordinary people. How about that? And then they have, they go to a party or something and dress up, but you're integrating. Fair to say?
Yeah. I mean, my life is kind of strange because I'm two people anyway. I'm like this media personality, and then I'm kind of a real person, and everybody in the media is. The reason I went by Liana K, it's actually a Kafka reference, Joseph K from The Trial, because, everyone in the media is guilty of something. We're just walking around not knowing quite what it is until they get you one day.
Right.
But cosplay it's a portmanteau of costume role play. So basically, it started in a district in Japan, not to go too deep, but I see it as a way of sort of embodying the best parts of something you really like. Mm-hmm. And instead of being an observer in something, sort of being a third person to sort of experience something in a very first person way. And I know I just described cosplay in gamer terms, but I'm a big nerd, Dave. I can't help it. But that's basically what it is. It's adult dress up on days that aren't Halloween.
Right. So, okay. So you get dressed up and then you're hanging out with other people mm-hmm. and they're dressed up and you're all pretending basically to be these characters too. It's not just that you're going out and doing the normal, you're actually these people.
So some people do, some people don't. I mean, I like to kind of go in between, especially with a villain when there's kids around. You don't want to go full blown and scare them.
Right.
But I mean, there was a guy, one of these kind of ambush radio guys on a local radio station, and I was wearing the Princess Leia bikini from Return of the Jedi. And he came up to me and started talking to me. I started responding in character. And you could see the longer it went on and on and on and on, he thought I was nuts.
Right.
And it worked for the purposes of this because it really threw him off his game.
Right.
But, he was going, put some clothes on. There's kids around. And I just turned to this kid, you guys seen my movie, right? They're like, yeah, you're Princess Leia. And at the end of the interview, he goes, you don't really think you're Princess Leia, do you? I'm like, no. And I started laughing. I mean, it actually was a way of me preserving certain theater skills. Improv skills and things like that I wasn't able to use when I started doing other sorts of work. So I know other people have different reasons to get into it. But for me, it was this really cool way to preserve skills because if you don't use it, you lose it.
Yeah. And I hope people don't think that I'm being judgy about it at all because I do love, and we're going to get into a lot of this now, I love nerd culture and sci-fi and geek stuff and Star Wars. I almost learned everything. I know about everything from Star Wars. So I love all that stuff. I've just never gone that route. But maybe one day you'll take me to the cosplay place and we'll play a little cos.
Whenever you're ready, I'll take you there.
I've had many people. I've had people over, but I will try it. I really will. I will at some point. All right, so
You
let's
kind of start with Halloween and make a costume you think would work at a convention, and then if you're feeling the urge when it's not Halloween, you've already got it.
Yeah, but is it too cliche for me to be a Jedi or somebody from Star Wars? Is that just thought of as like, another Jedi?
Dave, I have a life-size Yoda in my house, so the idea that anything related to the Force would be cliche, you're really asking the wrong person.
Wow.
Live and breathe Star Wars. So Yoda's my boy. And I mean, if you're more of a Sith in the real world, but you're okay because you trust your feelings. So you could be a Jedi and do it totally unironically. But I mean, I think a lot of people would go more for Han Solo with you with look.
Okay.
So I mean, the cool thing about cosplay is the characters people pick, I think, are really informative, right? I realized for a while I was playing a lot of man-hating Batman villains, and it was sort of a joke because I got into it, in late high school and when I was dealing with a lot of really militant feminists, and I think that was part of the coping at the time, but it was definitely working through certain conflicts, liking a lot of male-dominated stuff, this ability to do this really hyper feminine, slinky sort of, it permits you to do certain things and you get a positive response for it when normally it would be, let us slut, in that realm you can do it and it's contextualized in a way that is really fun instead of, as you said, judgy.
Right. Best Catwoman, would you say Eartha Kitt from the 60s show or Michelle Pfeiffer or Halle Berry?
In terms of the costume or in terms of the character?
I'll give you my answer on costume first. It has to be Michelle Pfeiffer because that thing was unbelievable. But in terms of character, what would you say?
Oh, God. Because Eartha Kitt was Eartha Kitt, right?
Yeah.
But then, I mean, Michelle Pfeiffer's Catwoman for me was such sort of, that what they were sort of doing with that character, what Tim Burton did was something I think I probably more identified with at the time. I mean, the cool thing about making that costume is I didn't just make the costume, I made it in the same way she did it. So I took old clothes and sort of cut them up and sewed them back together as sort of a patchwork. So it was almost this really cool process thing. But I do admit I kind of love that purple. But my favorite Catwoman costume is the Darwin Cook, rest in peace, redesign that they did in the comic books with the goggles and the very sort of Audrey Hepburn inspired look. I love that suit.
Oh, I can't say that I can think of that one off the top of my head, but I will do some Googling and I'm sure someone will put the link to it down below. So I was going to jump into video games, but just going off what you're saying about Catwoman and that the Michelle Pfeiffer Catwoman out of those three probably does fit what you do in your work the most because she was really, if people remember, that was in Batman Returns, the second of the original Batmans. She was really a flawed character and abused by her boss and dismissed, and she lived in a crappy apartment. And then she became this, super sexy, empowered woman, but was also a bad guy, yet had a certain moral code. So that sort of fits into a lot of the stuff you talk about with feminism and all of this, and cosplay and all this stuff.
Yeah, it's definitely a totem, if you will. It certainly is sort of a patron saint. I mean, that whole idea of, in a lot of spheres for women, you have a choice. You can be good and ignored or bad and matter. And this dichotomy that, Michelle Pfeiffer's Catwoman represented, and the fact that it requires, and this is like something straight out of an essay called Goodbye to All That by a second wave feminist named Robin Morgan, this idea that a woman in her life at some point will suffer an insult so great that it's like, that's it. That's when you hit, I am Catwoman, hear me roar. It's that.
That's when Stella got her groove back. Am I right?
Yeah, it's that. Well, that's when you get your groove in the first place, right? It was never there. Well, it might have been there when you were born, but then it was very taken from you quite early. But that whole idea that the last vestige of any pretense to conformity is gone. And I mean, yes, certainly there is some conformity of the femme fatale trope in Catwoman, but it is so much her own thing. And I mean, you got to remember that a lot of the Batman stuff does come about, rising up in the 1940s and things like that in that art direction. But it's such a good art direction, so I really don't care. It's so pretty, and it was a period that in its images really celebrated the feminine gender signifiers, for lack of a better term. And now we're not so good at that. We're not so good at just going, that is a representation of the feminine. Awesome, without looking to tear it down.
Yeah. So what do you make of that concept, though, that when she got her groove back, when she became Catwoman from this flawed, sort of quiet, demure woman, she then was a bad guy. And even though, as I said, in that movie at least, there were good elements to her too, and she sort of became a good person, a good guy at the end, but that once she got her thing, she now was thought of as a villain.
Well, now you're getting kind of academic on me. You're triggering my English literature background.
Yeah,
Trigger.
bring it. Let's go. Let's go.
Trigger.
Uh-oh.
She's officially an anti-hero. So in the tradition of Lord Byron, and there are very few female anti-heroes in media, and that's why she's so important. Lara Croft used to be one, not so much anymore. But the anti-hero is important because if you remember, you take the movie, there was a villain. That villain was the Penguin. Mm-hmm. And the Christopher Walken character was definitely villainous. She was an anti-hero. And so anti-heroes, Severus Snape is an anti-hero. It's all about characters that have the role of a hero, but have non-heroic elements to them. And they're very, very popular with male characters. But women, it's much fewer and far between. And that's part of the reason I really like her. I think more and more, a lot of the Batman, the Gotham girls, as they say, could be described as anti-heroes. Poison Ivy goes back and forth. She can be the villain 1 minute and then sort of an anti-hero when it's her and Harley Quinn. Harley's the same way. She started as sort of the Joker's mole, but more and more she's become this character the plot revolves around. And this idea of hero and villain is structural, right? It's who's telling the story. And sometimes the story is told from the point of view of the villain, but it's very rare. When you hit that protagonist role, it's usually an anti-hero.
Yeah. As you're saying this, it's reminding me of, if we can we jump from DC to Marvel for a second? Can you jump with me here?
I'm big on tangents.
All right. It reminds me sort of the origin story of Magneto, because, he grows up and he loses his parents in the Holocaust. I think it's at Auschwitz. And if you see the movies, they show the gates closing and the whole thing. And then because he was so scarred, he becomes a villain. And it's sort of similar. She was scarred for other reasons and became a villain. And that anti-hero, I think Magneto is the most interesting person in all of those movies because of that. Because you see that constant fight between knowing what he's been through and trying to get, revenge, but revenge will never actually satiate the pain. I think those are the most interesting characters.
Yeah, I mean, you got to remember when X-Men was created, Stan Lee was really cheeky about some of the names. I mean, the fact that, Magneto's sort of anti-hero counterpart, Mystique, there's a reason she was called Mystique. It's from Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, and the fact that she can morph into all these things. Magneto, it's funny that he's sort of become this gay icon because to me, I sort of, the fact that he was Jewish was so relevant to me. And, speaking to some older people who remember the Holocaust and all that stuff, that anger that he embodies and that righteous anger and that kind of idea that humanity's done, we are superior. And, we have to assume a superior status for the good of humanity. They'll serve us well when they recognize our superiority. It's a very human tendency. And I'd love to write Magneto's Guide to the Regressive Left and the Alt-Right. I mean, it would be such a cool book. We can collab on that one.
Absolutely.
It really is that idea of extremism and where it comes from. And using a Jewish character and then giving him names like the Brotherhood of Mutants and naming mutants Homo Superius and things like that. I know this is really nerdy that I know all this stuff,
No,
but
I'm with you. Yeah.
yeah, he's one of my favorite characters as well. And I mean, just the fact that he had that flowing hair as well. And he was really a mess of contradictions. And the sheer power in being able to control magnetism as well. You know, X-Men was a metaphor for fear of people who were different, straight up. Yes, sort of informed by the various civil rights struggles of the 1960s. But that's what it was about, just the inherent fear of people who are different. You had, the mutants being, trying to protect this group of people who hates and fears them. God, that's my mantra when I get out of bed some mornings. But then you had the mutants fighting each other, and it was practically predictive of what's going on right now. But I think it was actually observing what was going on at the time with the splintering within the civil rights movement, within the second wave feminist movement, within these movements. That's the cool thing about pop culture, is it observes what's going on in our world through a lens that is far enough away that it can really go in deep without freaking everyone out. And the fact that the big properties of our time are the Hunger Games and Harry Potter, that's going to be dissected at some point. I mean, that really says a lot about our collective cultural experience.
Yeah, so all that said, would you say that just because of the breadth of work and the relevance of it, that X-Men has sort of pulled off the comic book thing in terms of culture in the best way? I mean, when I was a kid, I loved comic books, but I was more into Spider-Man and Batman and G.I. Joe. X-Men was not huge for me, but I've come to love, even from those cartoons in the, I guess, mid-90s or so, that X-Men, because of the reasons that you're talking about, the way it really dealt with some, and deals with some real-world stuff, and the way that the movies have all sort of amazingly linked back and forth to each other in really crazy ways, that it is sort of, because of its cultural relevance and the success of the franchise, that's the standout one?
That the X-Men has had, it's been incredibly influential, but the 90s X-Men cartoon and the X-Men movies, people have to remember, before this whole Marvel Universe thing, before the whole Avengers thing, there was X-Men. Yeah. And before there was Batman, the animated series, that became this big thing, there was X-Men. And so it's been this breaker down of boundaries between geek culture and pop culture in a way that I don't think gets enough credit, because we couldn't have these blockbuster, Disney Marvel films were it not for the success of those X-Men films. Because, I mean, at the time they came out, that was a big risk, right? It wasn't a popular time because we had the Schumacher Batman films and everything was going kitschy. But they really, and I mean, obviously Batman, the animated series, had a lot to do with the respectability of superheroes as well. But on the film side, the X-Men films and Spider-Man were the big ones. But I really think credit goes to X-Men for showing that it can be done. I mean, showing that it can create stars, showing that it's not a junk part. Those were all really, really important things that first film did. That Star Wars did in a much bigger way back in the 70s, and things like Lord of the Rings have done. It's powerful because people don't go in and overthink it. And I love that about it. People go in there and watch a good movie. Yeah. And if if they walk away with a few pro-social messages, awesome. But that's not the purpose of the exercise. They can walk away and be just as brain dead as they were when they go in. It doesn't matter, right? People were entertained. And that's
really interesting, because I just watched the last X-Men movie, Apocalypse, like a week ago. And I thought it was great. And what I really thought was great about it was that it was action and fun and all that, and it gave you a little something, but that I could follow the plot, where most of these movies, even though I dig this stuff, I'm like, by the end, the last half hour, I'm always like, what just happened? Or, that terrible Batman, I don't know what you thought about Batman, Superman, but that thing was a disaster. So you're right, that giving you just enough and to walk out of there with maybe something that sparks a little something in you, I guess that's the magic sauce.
Batman versus Superman was a perfect example of a movie that tried to make a point, all caps, as opposed to just tell a story. And humans relate to humans. And this is a huge thing in all my work, that humans relate to humans. And if first and foremost, in fiction, you're not telling a human story about a particular individual or group of individuals, then you're writing a textbook. You're not telling a work of fiction, and it is gonna fail, especially in our current culture where people are so media savvy or perceive themselves to be so media savvy. They can smell that coming. I mean, this was what I learned in youth programming, the so-called millennial generation. They will kick your butt if you don't seem authentic. And I think that's a good thing for the public discourse in the long term. I just think it's gotten exceptionally loud now because of the short-term loss of faith in systems.